In the fall of 2021, while working as the San Francisco bureau chief for the New York Times, Thomas Fuller discovered the extraordinary story of the Cubs, a high school football team that was dominating their opponents on their way to a league championship. Now, you might think you've heard this story before, but there's a twist.
One day I got an email that said, hey, there's this team in Southern California. For 7 decades, they haven't done so well, but they're undefeated now. The team is at the California School for the Deaf in Riverside. And I said, I gotta go check this out. I got in my car and I drove down to Riverside, and it was Friday night. Watched them, really wallop their opponents. Talked to the coach of the opposing team, who was really shaken by it. He was like, don't think that you have an advantage against this team because they're deaf. They communicate better than any team I've ever played against. And so I was hooked. I was hooked on the story.
Fuller was so hooked that he stepped away from his job at the Times to fully devote himself to follow the team on their journey throughout the season of 2022.
I spent the next season on the sidelines every day, watching their practices, going to their games, interviewing all the kids, all the coaches, and doing a deep dive into deafness. Is deafness an edge? Is it maybe not a disability? There are lots of things about deafness that make it an advantage on the football field. I found that really fascinating.
Fuller's debut book, The Boys of Riverside, a deaf football team and a quest for glory, explores these questions while following the struggles and triumphs of the players on the team.
The kids who are there now are from every imaginable background, from all over the globe. It's really like an American dream situation. And they come to the California School for the Deaf, and they're all using ASL, American Sign Language. It was this like deaf brotherhood. You want to read a great American underdog story, here you go.
I'd like to thank Thomas Fuller for joining us today, the author of the book, The Boys of Riverside. Thank you very much for coming with us today.
Thank you, Rod. It's great to be here.
So you're based out of San Francisco, and you have worked as a journalist for a long time outside of the country, both in Southeast Asia and covered Europe. What led you to write this book about a deaf football team from Southern California?
So yeah, I was a foreign correspondent for 20-something years, most of the time in Southeast Asia, which was like, covering insurrections and coup d'etat and all that kind of stuff. And they sent me to the Bay Area. And so that was a different set of stuff that I covered, wildfires, shootings, all the stuff that goes wrong in our country. And one day I just got an email that said, hey, there's this team in Southern California. For 7 decades, they haven't done so well, but they're undefeated now. The team is at the California School for the Deaf in Riverside, which is just east of LA. And so I wrote a piece for the Times and then wrote what is my first book.
So tell me a little bit about the book. You wrote about a high school football team from the United States.
It's 8-man ball, which is for small schools, for rural schools, for native schools, and it's a fast game, so you take out a couple linemen. It's, miss a tackle, and that might be a touchdown. It's intense, it's physical, and I loved watching it. And so here's a deaf team, all deaf players, all deaf coaches, playing in a hearing league. And if deafness is a disability, how come this deaf team is beating the pants off all the hearing teams? So I looked into the science of it. I looked into the sociology of it, this idea that you have all these kids who never quite fit in when they played football on hearing teams when they were younger. You can imagine being a great athlete, hungry to play football, passionate about the game of football, but not being able to communicate with your own teammates. Then they come to the California School for the Deaf, and they're all, using ASL, American Sign Language, and forming this brotherhood, which I found really interesting. And then I took a deep dive into, like, is deafness an edge? You know, is it maybe not a disability as, you know, medically people would say, by law, you know, it's considered a disability. But in fact, there are lots of things about deafness that make it an advantage on the football field. I found that really fascinating. Better eyesight, more acute eyesight, because the brain pathways in a deaf brain reformulate, and so people who are profoundly deaf have better vision than hearing people. They are essentially hearing with their eyes, and what better skill if you're playing football than to have, you know, a vision of the field that is more acute, having peripheral vision that's better, having a detection of motion that is better. And a big part of what I looked into was how signing really helped the boys, the coaches, the team communicate in ways that confounded their hearing opponents, because you can imagine, instead of a huddle, you don't need a huddle. You just walk up to the line, you look over at the coach, you get the play, and off you go. And it's fast. It's really fast. And the hearing teams are like, wait, you know, we got to run over to the coach and get the next play, and then huddle. You know, so it's a great example of a different way of communicating that is perfectly adapted to football. And of course, there's no 12th man.
Or in this case, the 9th man.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, nothing is going to distract them noise-wise. Nothing is going to, you know, no such thing as trash talk.
And it was also sort of a home field advantage for them when they had other teams, because they were playing hearing teams, and they would come and the teams are used to actually hearing the crowd or hearing the whistle, something from the referees.
Yeah.
They would keep playing after the whistle because they couldn't hear a whistle.
Yeah.
That was going on. And there's even deaf history inside of American football as we know it, because the huddle was invented because of deafness. I mean, maybe you can go into that story a little bit too.
Absolutely. There's kind of a paradox, because, you know, I was just saying how they didn't need a huddle. There's an asterisk to that, which is they don't need a huddle if they're playing a hearing team, because they're just signing and they're counting on the hearing team not being able to intercept the signs. In the 1890s, one deaf team, Gallaudet University, was playing another deaf team, and the quarterback from Gallaudet was signing to his teammates and realizing this wasn't going to work because our opponents are reading our plays. And so he said, guys, come over here, gather around, backs to the, you know, our opponents. Let's gather in a huddle. And now if you go to a game at Gallaudet, the T-shirt or the ball cap will say, home of the huddle.
The book, I'd say about half of it is about the actual X's and O's, the playing of football, but the rest of it seem to be more profiles on the individual players. Could you talk about the school a bit and then talk about some of the individual players?
So there are two schools for the deaf in California. There's one in the Bay Area, and there's one in the Southlands, as they call, like the LA and San Diego area, and that's the Riverside School. The kids who are there now are from every imaginable background. It's really like an American dream situation where you have parents from Ethiopia, from Mexico, from Romania, all over the globe. One of the coaches was born in Tehran, and left before the revolution. And what they have in common, if you ask them, how do you identify? You know, you're a lot of things. You are Mexican American, you live in Riverside, you live in California, you live in the US, like, you know, all these things, like the hierarchy of identity, deafness is at the very top. And so they all come together and coalesce around deafness, despite their, varied backgrounds. And so the school has a, not huge enrollment. There are 50 boys in the high school. Half of them were on the football team. And, it's a tight-knit community. But yeah, you asked about a player too.
There are at least 8 to choose from.
There's so many personalities.
So many players, yeah.
There's a kid who's homeless, who sleeps in his father's car, but he loves football, and he sleeps in the Target parking lot across from the field, and he goes into Target, washes his face in the morning, and goes off to school. And he's a great athlete. There's a kid who is so athletic. He runs back kickoffs and punts. He is in the secondary, a cornerback or a safety. He's a wide receiver. When he's listed on the roster, it's just athlete. And he's a huge contribution to the team.
And his name is?
Felix Gonzalez.
Yeah.
And there's a chapter about him because he, has a career-ending injury that really set the team back because he was, absolutely the star. And then there's a kid named Christian Jimenez, and he is the class president, and he gets injured in a playoff game. It's his senior year, and he thinks, okay, that's it. That's the end of my football career. These kids had 3 years because of COVID of football. They didn't have 4 years, so it's even a bigger blow, to know that that's it. Your high school career is over. But I'm on the field, and it's a couple days before a big game, and I see Christian, and I say, "What are you doing here?" He's in full pads, and I was like, "Your leg is broken. How are you going to be playing?" He said, I'm playing. And I was like, okay. He found a brace on Amazon for $200. He put it on his leg, and he played the next game with a broken leg. And by the way, he won all of his battles in the trenches in that game. So the grit and the determination of these players was super impressive.
You covered 2 different seasons of the Cubs, 2021 season and the 2022 season. I don't want to give anything away that you don't want given away, but they weren't just good because they were deaf and able to hide all of their signs. They were dominating both hearing and non-hearing teams. Like you mentioned, they did have a time playing against deaf teams, and those teams had almost no chance. I mean, they were devastating against their teams. What made them so good? You did mention they seemed to be a band of brothers, but also what made them so much better than teams even at the same school, because they had no record of winning before that?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously, if the school's been around for 70 years, then okay, it's not just what we've been talking about that gave them the edge. I think there are a couple things. I think this was just a great collection of athletes. For one, they loved the game of football. They had grown up together. And also, even though it's been a deaf school for 7 decades, the coaches in the past, for most of the existence of the school, were often hearing coaches. And so you had a language barrier within a team. And it was only in the last 15 years or so, let's say the last couple decades, that the coaches were 100% deaf as well. So you had all of the instruction, all of the play calling, and all of the players deaf. And I think that, further served the question of cohesion.
And I don't want to give away too much in the book, but maybe one of the coaches, maybe you could talk a little bit about your favorite one.
Maybe since we talked about him already, Kaveh Angorani is the defensive coordinator. He's born deaf in Iran. It's not a friendly place.
Around what time was this?
Late 60s. And so he is growing up in pre-revolutionary Iran, which is a cosmopolitan place. It's before women were forced to cover up. It's when Americans and Europeans were expats, there. And so it has that international flair, but it's also, for a deaf kid, a tough world. And his mother is so distraught that her son is deaf because she is worried that he's going to have a hard time in life, in marriage, in everything. And so she goes to a very famous shrine in Iran, and she prays, help me with my son. And eventually she meets an American woman who recommends that she send her son to Hartford, to the oldest school for the deaf in America. And it's a tough decision, for a mother to send her son to a boarding school very far away, but she does it. And Kaveh, super athletic boy, had been playing soccer forever. He arrives in America and notices that they play a different kind of football and really gets into the game, loves it. The story that I really liked about his adaptation and his family's adaptation to this strange land, America, he's working in a photo shop in California after he graduates from college, and the manager of the shop is pretty insensitive and says, look, you're deaf. Can you kind of be in the back room here? I don't want you interfacing, with the customers. And Kaveh, doesn't take this very well. And I don't know how it happens, but he ends up bringing a lawsuit against, this manager. The manager is, I have to say, slightly inept because he wrote down the request order that Kaveh go into the back room. So in terms of evidence, it's right there. Kaveh sues, and he wins $25,000. That helps him further his education. And he tells his mother in Iran, he says, hey, this happened to me, and I sued, and I got $25,000. And, she doesn't know America. And she says, huh. She says, sue more people.
So he's American. Or at least his mom is American at
That's
heart.
it. Confirmation that, he became. And now he's in Riverside. He's got a, house with a swimming pool. And his mother, who's still around, is still in Iran. But you can imagine how she feels about, the son that she worried about so much is now thriving in California.
Now, you were born in the United States. You've lived a lot of other places, and you had two full or a season and a half with this deaf football team. Did you learn any ASL yourself, and were you able to use that in your as a tool in your reporting?
I did, and I'm actually half French, so I am fluent in French. I'm bilingual. I speak Thai because I lived there for 13 years or something. I speak Malay, although that's fading a little bit. So I'm good with languages. Mm-hmm. And I said when I went into this, I was like, yeah, look, I'm going to pick up ASL and do all my reporting in ASL. Well, it's an enormously nuanced, complex, sophisticated language. And I learned to fingerspell, which means, A, B, C. You learn basically how to spell things out, but that's not ASL. That's one tiny component of it. I learned pretty quickly that, I had 7 months to do this project, that it was either try and master ASL, good luck in 7 months, or, really bear down on the story and then have Malik Angorani, my interpreter, by my side, all the time. The coach that I mentioned, Kaveh Angorani, who was born in Iran, his daughter's a college student. She's a hearing person. She's a CODA, child of deaf adults. And she was my interpreter for the whole project, and she was terrific. So without that, it would have been impossible. I mean, she was really there interpreting the entire time, telling me intercepting conversations and really eavesdropping. But I did come away with a really deep appreciation of ASL and a language that for a long time was not considered a real language.
Really?
Was derided as just sort of gestures, and it's only in the last 50 years that research has been done showing the grammar and the complexity of the syntax, and that the grammar and the syntax have direct parallels to spoken languages. And to see that evolution in person was incredible, because one of the coaches on the team, Ken Watson, when he was in school, was not allowed to sign. He wasn't allowed to use ASL. If he did, he was made to write on the blackboard, "I will not use ASL. I will not use," hundreds of times, because there was a feeling at the time that instead of learning ASL, which is great for communication amongst the deaf community, that kids should go the oral route, that they should try and lip read, that they should try and speak, which you can imagine is enormously difficult, but that they should try and have these skills that would allow them to integrate into the wider hearing world. Good intentions, but to strip away ASL from a community where it's so naturally used was a real tragedy for the kids. I mean, they would sneak it in. The language, absolutely persisted and grew and flourished despite all of these restrictions. And to have Ken Watson, who had been punished when he was at school using ASL, and now he's a coach on a team that is winning partly because they're using ASL, was just a delicious historical irony.
Were you a football player? I mean, it's an interesting choice if you weren't, or were you a football fan? And American football is an American-Canadian sport for the most part. And it's interesting that you would decide to make your first book about something, having been an international correspondent, worked in many places around the world, that you would make it about American football. Is that part of your background?
So a couple things. One is I'm a lifelong fan, no laughter please, of the New York Jets.
Oh, well, cut the interview.
Needless to say, I understand the position of the underdog. And I sort of kept the flame going, while I was overseas all those years. I think it was 26 years that I was overseas. I studied in Paris. I went to college in Paris. But I kept the flame going. And with the internet, you can now watch games. I used to get up in the middle of the night and watch my beloved Jets. My son is now on his varsity football team as the kicker this year, and he's like, "Why do we like the Jets?" He's tried to rebel against it, but he has now assumed he's taken on the inheritance of being a Jets fan.
That's what he's told you.
That's what he's told me. I have proof. But I love football. I love the game. I love the aspect of it that's sort of like chess on a field. But I love the game. And when this came along, I mean, it's weird that, someone who spent a career covering like international politics and literally like, insurrections and, tsunamis and earthquakes, overseas, natural disasters. This, life takes you on, on weird turns, and this is definitely one of them.
Do you see this going into another medium? Do you see audio? Do you see video? Do you see a movie out of this? Because in many, many ways, this visually and orally, this story can be told and go well beyond what you've been able to put in print.
I like that the starting point is a book. I like that it's now written down, that it's, recorded, I would say properly, because it's, documented and it's 100% nonfiction. If, sure. I mean, if anyone is welcome to, pick up the ball and take it in another direction.
That line needs to be edited. Do you have another book in you? Is it going to be another football book, or do you think you'll move on to other subjects if you decide to do another novel or piece of nonfiction? I loved writing a book. I didn't realize that I would, and a lot of people said to me, you're going to go crazy, after the fifth revision, after the 10th fact checking, and I love the process from start to finish. One of the things I really liked about it is that when I'm writing daily journalism, it's like a laser beam. Like okay, I'm writing about the Park Fire in Northern California, and here's I'm going to quote a firefighter, and he's going to, and he says, this is a really fast-moving fire. We're having to do this and that, and but that firefighter has a whole past, a whole context, a whole life, and a book allows you to meander like the Mississippi and just. And hey, let's go off and and take that tangent. Let's do this detour. So I'm now back, back to the grind of writing my laser beam articles. But I would love to be able to meander again, on another book project. I got to find the right one. Well, Thomas Fuller, thanks for sitting down with us and talking about this bit of off the beaten path for you journey with your book. I think it is highly successful in telling this story.
Thank you so much, Rad. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure.